So we went over kind of 4 topics, or terms, really, but then also within terms, the definitions, the context put together. We touched on self-interest is the motivating factor that leads to what we call in sociology kind of the royal, what we'd say is a rational choice theory or rational choice approach, where individuals make decisions that seem rational, and the rational component to that is that you do things that will either make your life better or at least maintain the quality of life that you have right now. We don't tend to do things, again, consciously without rationalizing them, destructive things, knowing that they're going to ultimately be destructive, thinking that the benefit's going to outweigh the cost. And so with that in mind, and recognizing that we all individuals, that applies to all individuals, rational choice approach, that we're all in competition for those resources that we describe as being both limited and or finite. And as such, that's where we get to the friction that we find in government or politics, Democrats, Republicans, individuals vying for positions of power, where the power is ultimately the process of deciding who gets what, right? That's ultimately the power. So we touched on self-interest, touched on government, politics. We spent quite a bit at the end of the class really talking about ideology, particularly political ideology. And then finished up with the breaking down representative democracy. All right. And so just a quick recap again. Remember, government's the people and the institutions that carry out politics. Politics is in and of itself a process. It's the process of deciding who gets what, or the allocation of scarce resources, right? And then beyond that, government also structures society. So there's some things that aren't necessarily tied to the allocation of resources, but they allow us to interact with one another in a way that ensures that we don't crash into one another, right? So setting up like which lane to drive in, right? We don't let people just simply choose which lane to drive in from day to day, right? I'm going to drive in the left lane today. I'm going to drive in the right. We set it up so individuals recognize, and the law supports that you drive in the right lane, and there's right of way and stopping at stop signs and all these different rules, which don't really have anything to do with the allocation of resources, but do have something to do with structuring society and putting us all on the same page, so we know how, or we can interact with one another without, again, crashing into each other. So government also, carries out that function as well. But the big one, and the one that ultimately can really impact the quality of life of individuals, it doesn't matter if we all drive on the left side of the road or all drive on the right side of the road, as long as we're picking a side. But once we start talking about allocation of resources, if you get it, and you don't get it, and you get it, and I don't get it, now all of a sudden the laws are impacting individuals differently, and you can understand where, again, that competition may arise. So in that process of deciding who gets what, this is where it gets sticky. Now, ideology, we touched on that quite a bit in terms of what that role of government should be. Remember, we went from the far extremes of the left, and this is by design. So when we're talking about left and right, when you hear individuals talk about left and right in terms of referring to politics, right? You're watching a Sunday talk show or whatever the case, and they're talking about the left, the right. This is what they're referring to. Ideologically, the left and the right regarding the proper role of government and what government ultimately should do. And remembering that we got the equality or security side, and we also have the freedom or liberty side. And one favors the individual, the other is focused on the collective. The further you go to the left, the more government you're going to need, right? So this would be government. Because it's very controlled, it's very it's very structured in terms of who again gets what, in terms of making sure the laws are applied equally or have even an equal outcome, and that takes a lot of oversight and a lot of tinkering and a lot of again, a lot of enforcement. So the further you go to the left, the larger government becomes, either in number, but also in terms of impact. And the further you go to the right, the smaller government becomes, right? To the point of where we get into what we talked about in terms of anarchism. And that would be that ideology, that comprehensive set of beliefs that government's really not necessary, right? And versus government's very, very necessary. In fact, it should be integrated into our everyday life to the point of where we're constantly thinking about it and we become one with it. And that was that communism side as an ideology. And then all parts in between, right? Because this is a spectrum, it's all parts in between, a blending that looks like a bell curve. It's not exactly, but it looks like a bell curve where you and I, and if we plotted everybody in the United States, we hug the center, because who doesn't want equality? Who doesn't want the government to treat them equally, right? And then who doesn't want freedom? Who doesn't want to be able to do what's in their best interest, even if they don't necessarily believe that the government approves, so to speak. And most people want both of those things, right? That's why we hug the center. We want as much of each of those as we can possibly get without giving up totally on the other. And so that pushes us towards the center. And again, very few at the extremes. Most individuals are in the center. We have that socialism, and then what we call libertarianism, and then democratism. I'm just tacking an ism on the end of these now, and republicanism. And when we get into talking about political parties, we'll see how they line up. And one of the reasons I use the democratism and republicanism is because the two major parties do service the majority of individuals in the center. And then when it comes to political parties, and we did talk about this, the political parties, unlike the spectrum here, there's no gaps in the spectrum, right? It's a bleeding of one to the next. But when it comes to political parties, there is overlap. And there is gaps, right? So the Democrat Party may be out here, where you get some overlap in terms of individuals who would, be socialists within the Democrat Party. And the same thing is true over here with libertarians and the Republicans. Good place for the Tea Party, for example. And then you've got this gap in between, which is where our independents are, right? Individuals who consider themselves to be independents. Right? And even though they're independent from a party, they're not a Republican or Democrat, they don't claim to be a Republican or Democrat, they still have an ideology. Right? So we talked, that's the difference between political parties and ideologies. And when we get to the political parties, we can take a look at their platforms. In fact, we'll do that as we get a little further in class. We'll actually take a look at the platforms of the political parties, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about in terms of favoring freedom in the individual and a smaller government versus equality, the collective, and what takes a larger government. And you'll see it in the platforms of the parties. And the platform of a political party is what the party stands for. If it gets elected, should win government. Those are the goals and the mission of the party. Okay. Did anybody have any questions over that? Right. And this one's really not reflected in our lecture notes. The part that is that quality of life hill, where we talk about conservatives and liberals, right? Progressives and conservatives. And this could flip-flop, right? It doesn't have to be this way, but currently speaking, individuals who are further to the right tend to be more conservative when it comes to the systems in place and protecting the system that is in place and the structure that's in place. And those individuals on the left are more likely to be progressives who want to change the system. The system's not fair, it's not equitable, so therefore it needs to be changed. And again, this is also a spectrum, right, between staunch conservatives and staunch progressives, and you have a blending of different individuals in between, and we get close to that middle class of individuals, right, who may not necessarily identify with a political party. And the reason for that is because when it comes to the system itself and how it's impacting them and their quality of life, they go either way. They go either way. A little more government might be a good thing. A little less government might be a good thing, vice versa. And so puts them closer to the center, and I think it puts them closer to the center ideologically in our spectrum as well. All right, questions? All right, so then we talked about, and we kind of quickly went through this representative democracy. Again, the idea demos kratia, right? The people to rule. And we don't have a direct democracy in the United States. Not every individual gets to have a direct say in taxes or sentencing guidelines or anything like that. What we do is we spend our time, right? We spend our time doing our thing in this capitalistic system that we have, and we choose individuals to represent our interests. That's where the democracy part comes in, that you and I collectively throw a hand up behind different individuals in support of those individuals representing our interests. All right, and so it's the representatives of the people to rule. That's the system that we have in place. And as I think I said very early on in class with those positions in a vehicle, right? Where are you? Are you in the passenger seat? Are you in the driver's seat or the trunk? Right, the passenger seat, the driver's seat, and those individuals who don't, again, understand the system or exercise, they're naive or ignorant to the system, they're in the trunk, all right? But here, your place, your solid place through our representative democracy is to be in that passenger seat. And I hope, as I've said already, I hope that you see yourself being in the driver's seat, right? There's no reason that you yourself shouldn't be or couldn't be in the big chair, representing your district. Who better to represent what you know to be best for your community than you, right? So I don't have the qualifications for that. The qualifications, they're not really high. The qualifications to running for political office aren't really high. There's not a real high, so it may be more of a, I don't see myself doing it because I don't like people. I don't want to put myself in that position. I don't have an interest in that. That's okay, right? As long as it's not, well, I don't know anything about that, or that's not me, right? I'm not rich. You don't have to be rich. We'll talk about that later as well. So we have a system that we call representative democracy. That's our system of government. There's more to it than that, but when we talk about the government, the people and the persons that make these decisions about who gets what, technically you and I are in charge of those individuals. They represent our interests, right? And our political ideology will determine how we want that government to operate in terms of making those decisions of structure and really deciding who gets what. That's the big piece. So it all goes together. Okay. Anybody have any questions? All right. So as I think we talked about also early, just again in terms of the structure of the class, the first part of the class or the first couple of days of class really is just the introduction, kind of an overview, right? You read that common understanding, you read the originalist perspective, gives you again kind of that, I think to some degree it gives us the end of where we're trying to get, good understanding of government, putting you again in that passenger seat squarely, or in the driver's seat if you have that interest to do so, and recognizing that you, again, not only the power you have as a citizen, but also hopefully to instill within you kind of that energy to want to be as actively involved and to take control of your government to the best that you can. So the first part is the introduction. Now we're going to give kind of a historical background as to the system that we've come up with and why we have this representative democracy. We don't have to have a representative democracy. The fact that we have a representative democracy structured the way it is in our American system of government, it doesn't have to be like that. In fact, you can look throughout the world and there's plenty of other different governing structures. And then historically, we can look back and we can look back at some very different, again, governing structures. All governments do the same thing. Right? They decide who gets what, they structure society, but they go through the same 5 steps. You go through these 5 steps. And again, I know I touched on this, that common understanding, but how this fits back in, that build, formulate, adopt, implement, evaluate, those are consistent with every governing structure throughout the world, throughout time. If you call yourself government, you decide who gets what, and you go through that process via these 5 steps. And people look at this and they go, well, isn't that kind of like the scientific method? Yeah, it is like the scientific method, right? There's some truth to that. But in terms of the policy process, right? And we've seen that word process because, again, politics is a process. Well, this is the political process broken down into its 5 steps. And these 5 steps, again, are universal and they're consistent. If you call yourself government, you'll go through these 5 steps. For example, if I'm a dictatorship, the rule of one individual, then I'm the individual who builds, formulates, adopts, implements, and evaluates. And it all rests with me. To build is to identify an issue or a problem that needs addressing, right? So as a dictator, I get to decide what's a problem. You can come to me and say, hey, this is a problem. I say, it's no problem, right? And you wake up, disappear. And then you come to me and say, hey, I got this problem. I go, it's not a problem, right? And then you come up to me and we like each other and I go, hey, I got this problem. I go, I will take care of that problem for you. All that power in the hands of that one individual, that's a dictatorship to first identify the problem. Then the next step, of course, after we identify the problem, government's supposed to solve the problem, right? So the next step is to really formulate. When you think of the term formulate, think of it like formula. Think of it, get in your mind like a scientist trying to get the formula just right. And to get the formula just right, you got to know what the problem is really well. And then you have to start thinking about what solutions you could possibly use to fix the problem. So there's a lot of guessing going on, a lot of getting, again, that formula just right. Right, so you get to know the problem really well. You say, hey, I've got this problem. Now I'm going to formulate a solution to this problem. You've got to know the problem well. You've got to come up with a solution. And this is where there's a lot of questions being asked, right? If we're going to solve this problem, though, we got to choose a course of action. And that's the next step, to adopt, right? I'm going to choose, and I'm going to say the best solution. And I put best in quotations because, again, best is, if the solution works, if it's the best solution, there's a lot of ways to, the old saying, there's a lot of ways to skin a cat, right? There's a lot of ways to solve problems. And you might do it by adding more government. You might do it by putting more responsibility on individuals. You may do it by raising taxes. You may do it by there's a number of different ways to try to solve problems within government, right? But best is subjective, right? There may be a whole group of individuals, who would say, look, this is something that we need more government for. And another group of individuals say, no, we don't need more government for that. We either need to enforce the laws we already have in place, so we need, again, more adherence to the law, or maybe the law is conflict, and so we don't necessarily need this law on the book. There's different ways that we can approach a problem, and it's not necessarily going to be agreed upon. We may not agree that there's a problem, right? So I'm going to come back to that in terms of representative democracy and ideology and how that affects this. But right now we're dealing with dictatorships. So the problem's been identified. They're looking for the solution. The one individual says, okay, this is what we're going to do. We've now adopted. Adopting on paper, great. But I've had a million great ideas on paper. It's that execution, it's that carrying it out, right? That next step. That's where the rubber hits the road, right? The implementation. This is to carry out the actual solution. So now you've carried out the solution, and then all that's left is evaluation. Did it work? Right? Did it work? And if the answer is no, well, you still got a problem. If the answer is yes, you don't have a problem anymore. Can you move forward? Well, we could create new problems by solving this problem. Again, one individual in a dictatorship does all 5 steps. They are, right? They are the legislative body, they're the executive body, and they're the judicial body, all rolled into one individual. We took these steps, right? And then broke these steps out and said, okay, rather than the caprice of one individual, a king or a dictator, we're going to break this out. And so our system of government, as you know probably from high school, right? It's 3 branches or 3 branches, 3 powers, and those powers are separate, and there's checks and balances. But these are the powers. When your 8th grade teacher or your civics teacher was talking about the separation of powers, these are the powers. And this is how they're separated, right? So this is the legislative powers. Legislature builds, formulates, and adopts in our American system of government. The executive branch then carries out implementation, oversight, implementation, the executive branch, the bureaucracy. And then formally, the judicial branch evaluates. Now, it's not just really the question of did it work. Everybody asks that, right? We ask that. We identify the problems through a representative or legislators, work on those problems, come up with solutions, the executive carries it out. We're the ones who really ultimately identify a problem or not a problem. It's not really the question formally of did it work. Really, for the judicial branch, it's the question of is it constitutional? Right? Can you do it? Yeah.
So is the executive branch just implement, or is it technically adopt and implement?
No, just implement. Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of students kind of, because of the checks and balances with the veto and the signing of the law, they see that as a function of adoption. But when it comes to this process, the solution, that's written by the legislature. The legislature writes the law, right? Writes the solution. The executive, we give the executive in terms of checks and balances, both at the state level, our governor has this, as well as the executive at the national level, the president has this. We give them the ability to say, I see what you adopted. I'm not going to implement that. Right? I'm not carrying that out. That's the veto. Right? And then they send it back to them and say, look, if you can change this up, maybe I can implement it, but I'm not going to implement it the way it's written. But you've got to change it up because the legislature writes the laws. So adoption is here. Now, again, if the executive comes out and says, I see what's coming on, I see what's making its way through the chambers, I'm going to veto that as soon as it is dead on arrival, that may have an impact on shaping the policy that's ultimately written. But at the end of the day, the legislature writes the laws, the executive implements, carries out those laws. And as long as they're constitutional, right? As long as they're constitutional, the executive is bound to carry out those laws. Right? And we'll talk about that because it gets a little hairy when executives stand up and say, I'm not going to carry that out. That's really dangerous. I mean, they can do that for the veto process, but the problem is that legislatures and executives pass laws that then are on the books, and then new governors or presidents come into place, and they're bound by those same laws on the books. So their opportunity to veto it, it's not there for them. So they're bound to carry it out. And if they choose not to carry it out, you're really flirting with breaking the Constitution. The responsibility of the executive is to implement the laws as long as they're legal and constitutional. Now, they may challenge it and say, I don't think it's constitutional, that's why I'm not going to do it. That's going to create, right, bringing the courts into it. All right. And we've seen the courts getting more and more and more involved, particularly with this current administration, but the courts are getting more and more involved. They have been for a number of years because there always seems to be a challenge as to whether or not an executive branch can do something or can't do something. And sometimes it comes just from the judges themselves, right? Somebody asks, do a judge shopping, some district judge in some, district in, I don't know, Southern Arizona or whatever says, no, you can't do that. And then that puts the whole kibosh on the full, executive branch's operations until that's actually gone through the judicial process. And that can be time consuming, but it is as it is. All right. Great question. Other questions? All right, so let me continue on. Good. Anytime you guys have a question, don't hesitate, because if you have it, chances are somebody else may have it as well. And so, all right. So then the judicial branch then does that. Not just does it work, because again, that's a question regarding a problem or not. It's, is it constitutional? And we'll touch on how we got to what's called judicial review in a bit, but that's really what's going on in terms of judicial review. That's our American system. And if you pull up in your Constitution and you break your Constitution, you look at, this is Article 1, this is Article 2, and this is Article 3. It's pretty smart cookies there, right? They actually broke down the steps in the process in order, assigned them to a branch. Right, the legislative branch, the power of the legislature shall be vested in a Congress. Right, the very first words of Article 1, the executive branch, the power of the executive will be vested in the President of the United States. Right, and then the judicial branch. And then 4 is the states. 5 is amending the Constitution. 6 is supremacy. 7 is ultimately the ratification of the Constitution. Pretty simple document. But the point is that our American system of government is broken down and it follows this. So these are separate branches. And then one of the checks and balances that was just pointed out is, for example, the legislature says, well, we build, identify problems and come up with solutions. Your job is to carry out the solutions. We don't just allow the legislature to run roughshod over the executive. The executive has some authority to say, look, I represent all the states. You may represent a portion of the states or a portion of the individuals, but I represent everybody. And I just don't see that this is a great idea for the whole of the United States. And so I'm not going to implement this. All right. So we give the executive that power of veto to stop something in its tracks before it actually gets implemented. But the plan has been adopted. Right? You can take this a different way. If you're looking to build a house, you've identified, I need a house. I need a house. Well, what kind of house do you want? That's all formulation, right? So what kind of house do you want? You want a big house? You want a small house? You want a ranch? 3 stories, 2 stories? You want a pool? You want no pool? A 7-car garage? No garage? You're brainstorming, you're formulating the solution to that problem. I need a house. This is the house I want. Eventually, you settle on the house you want. And you have it all drawn up and it looks just right. Okay? So those are your architectural plans. Now you take it to the builder. The builder looks at that and goes, I can't build that. I'm not building that, right? Where's your house? There is no house. It's on paper. It's on paper until you get the builder to actually build the house, right? And so maybe you got to work back with the builder. The builder sends it back and goes, that won't, the weight of that house will not be supported by this foundation. You need to change this, stupid architect. And then the architects get back together and go, all right, we'll rewrite this, and here we do this, we'll do this. And then we send it back, and then maybe the builder says, okay, you know what, I can build that. Right? That's our checks and balance process. And then the evaluation, right? The informal evaluations, you get done with the house and you go, oh, I hate it, right? Well, then you still need a house. Or you get done with it and go, oh, that's exactly what I was looking for. This is fantastic. Great. House problem solved. Does that make sense? Government operates the same way, right? Government operates the same way. You're going to come find a lot of builders, right? A lot of individuals that, just like building a house, right? Where it may be the general contractor, but then you've got the guy doing the wiring, the one putting in the flooring, the team that puts together the heating and cooling system. All these different specialized individuals who also have a say in whether or not this works or doesn't work. And that's your bureaucracy. All right. All these individuals who can throw a wrench into the carrying out of the process because of their position. Does that all make sense? All right. And again, our Constitution lays that out. Right? It's pretty smart individuals. Again, dictatorship, we can get rid of these 3 branches. One individual goes through all of it. This is the house you're going to build. We don't want to build that house. You're going to build that house. All right, we'll build that house. I don't like this house. You're dead. You guys, new house builders. Dictatorships, very easy. Very easy. Not very egalitarian. Very easy. This, not so easy. Right? But this is the system that, again, brings you, the individual, into this governing process. Where? How? Well, a couple of places. Obviously, excluding the judges, we elect these individuals, right? These individuals are elected, okay? And beyond electing these individuals, you and I, through our organizations, we apply pressure to these individuals, call it lobbying. We apply pressure to these individuals to shape policy, to identify problems, all right? So your hand really comes in a couple of different ways. One, directly voting. That's the big one. And the expectation or the hope is that every individual is engaged in that process. Not voting just to vote, but voting with an informed vote. I mean, that's your tool. That's your piece. That's how you get the legislature to identify the problems that you see as problems. That's how you get the legislator to come up with plans that you see as the right plans, the right solutions, to build the house that you want. This is where it comes in. And again, even after the vote, you're still valuable. Your power is still there. You're now being represented by somebody who professes to represent the whole district. So even if you didn't vote for that individual, they're supposed to represent you. And so you should still be applying pressure through contact, knowing who these elected officials are, contact and letting them know. That's the reaching over and grabbing the wheel every once in a while. Just, hey, right? Hey, can I get a skylight in my room? That's your role. That's the power that you have. Okay? And again, so just to cue you in as you're thinking about the power that you have or how to expand upon it. Not only is there voting and being an intelligent voter, right? An intelligent voter, someone who's thinking in terms of rational choice, thinking of what's in their interest, what's in their family's interest, their community's interest, their state's interest, their nation's interest, that you're voting that way, and who's going to be able to deliver on that. But then also staying up and on top of those individuals once they get elected. They work for you, right? I don't know how many individuals have their own houses or individuals have their own businesses, but I mean, even when you hire somebody to do something, you still want to kind of have some oversight. I mean, you hire someone to mow your lawn, you're still going to check to make sure that they're, mowing the lawn, that they're dumping the grass in the back of their truck and not just behind your garage or something like that. You keep oversight of those individuals. So even after we've hired them by electing them, you still want to have oversight. You still want to stay on top of those individuals. And there's ways to do that. One, first is just to know who represents you, right? But then on top of that, joining the organizations or even the political parties that favor the candidates or favor your ideology helps you to stay in better contact and give better oversight to these individuals while they're in office. So my recommendation is, again, not only just voting intelligently, right? Knowing why you're voting and how it positively impacts you or can positively impact you, right? Based upon your interests, material, solidarity, propulsive, but also thinking about joining a political party, right? I always tell students, pick any political party you want, but remember, it's a two-party system. And it really is. And I know that libertarians win office, they certainly do, and so do Greens, and so do other third-party candidates. But when it comes to the legislature up in Lansing, Republicans and Democrats. When it comes to the legislature in Washington, D.C., it's Republicans and Democrats. Even Bernie Sanders, who is an independent, a socialist Democrat, he still caucuses with the Democrats. He's still a Democrat vote, ultimately. So it comes down to Democrats and Republicans, and you ultimately should at least choose a side. And then when you choose a side, think about the two major political parties, and at least, if not being very actively involved, be tacitly involved, because it keeps you involved with these individuals who are ultimately making decisions that directly affect you, right? They affect the cost of college. They affect the cost of gasoline. They affect the minimum wage. They affect the alternative minimum tax. They make all of these decisions, and that affects you. So it's not, again, just checking up on the lawn guy to make sure he's not dumping the clippings behind your garage. These are the guys who are making decisions regarding marriage and death taxes and whatever. Everything is being decided through government. At least everything can be decided through government. All right? And so staying on top of that means getting to know who these individuals are, but then really getting to know who these individuals are and involving yourself. Political parties are a good way to do that. If that's not your gig, I get it. I understand, right? You may be an independent. You don't want to sully yourself with that. Okay. Then at least think about the interest groups. What are interests that you have? Right? If you're not going to belong to the political party, what interests do you have? Are you getting into nursing? And nurses have interest groups, whether it's the union or some organization, the American Medical Association. Those are all lobbying organizations that work on your interests. Sierra Club, for the environment, PETA for the animals, right? NRA for shooting, hunting, and firearm rights. If those are the things that you are that are of interest to you, that are of concern to you, then get involved with those organizations, because they become a louder mouthpiece for those interests, right? And they speak for now, right? The NRA speaks for thousands of individuals, and that carries a little bit more weight than the one guy saying, hey, we should have silencers because as a hunter, I don't want to, damage my ears. One person saying that, okay, the full heart of the NRA saying something like that, these individuals will listen. So it's a way for you to maybe target your interest, the interest groups versus the political parties, but it's another way for you to, again, be even more active in that passenger seat as the navigator. All right. So there's a lot more than just voting to this whole process of empowering you to get out of government what's, the house that you want. Okay. Questions? None? All right. All right. So, even though this next part is really going to be about the history that gets us to where we are and gives us context to the Constitution we end up with, right? How did we end up with this? We didn't start here. We didn't start with this structure of government of empowering individuals to get to decide the house that they want to live in. We didn't start there, right? We had ruling classes and bloodlines and birthrights and individuals anointed by God to be leaders and rulers. That was the system that preceded ours, right? So how did we get to where we are? And even though, like I said, this is the history part, this isn't a history class per se. There's some great history instructors that teach these kind of foundations of our American history. Ray Bruler, Michelle Wright, and others. They're the guys, they're the individuals who give you the kind of the year by year, step by step. I'm going to jump around quite a bit. And I will never ask you for a year. What year did this happen? What year did this happen? That's not my class, okay? But what I do want you to get out of this is kind of a timeline, right? What comes before what? Because that gives us the context that then leads to that Constitution, right? The American Revolution, right? The Declaration of Independence, the American Revolution, Shays' Rebellion, the first attempted secession from South Carolina, the Civil War, how those things come in place in steps give context to interpretation of the Constitution, whether it's the 14th Amendment, the 13th Amendment, all the way on down. The Constitution itself. We didn't start with the Constitution, right? We didn't start. Each state had its own Constitution, right? And then we joined in an agreement called the Articles of Confederation that the states were bound to. And then we scrapped that for the U.S. Constitution, the federal system, which gave more weight and power to a central government. And that central government has really been growing ever since, right? But we don't start with it. We don't just jump right in. So how do we get there? And how did we get to the Constitution? So when it comes to the history, timelines, not cherry picking, but pulling the events out of our history that go directly to giving some context to that Constitution. So if we take the originalist perspective, which again, remember, there's only one proper way to interpret the written word, and that is, anybody? What's that? As the author intended it to be interpreted, right? That is the only proper way to interpret the written word. The problem, as we've already said, is that the individuals who wrote the Constitution, they're dead. So our ability to ask them, what did you mean by this? It's limited, right? So there's some problems with that. So the best we can ultimately do is go back into the history and take a look at what are the writings, what support might be there, and what's going on that can give us some context to the content. And that's the best that we can do if we want to truly apply the originalist perspective to the laws of the land and that relationship between you and your government. So I'm going to take us all the way back to the beginning, right? So in the beginning, there was nothing. And then boom, this big bang. Now, that's probably a little bit too far back, right? All right, so it's really hard to get that feedback of how, I can see you guys are laughing, I just can't hear it. So, all right, so let's fast forward a couple billion years. Really, we're gonna go to Columbus, all right? What year does Columbus sail the ocean blue?
1492.
Beautiful. Yeah, 1492. So Columbus sails the ocean blue, and the objective there, does anybody know what the objective of Columbus's voyage? Yeah.
Go around the back of the world and get route this thing, India for spices.
Yeah, right. So he's going around the back of the world. I like that, right? The belief is, for a lot of individuals at the time, the kind of the science, right, the settled science, was that the world was flat, and that you didn't want to go too far out from the side of shore, or you'd go over, the edge. And so the tried and true path to getting to the Orient, which had really grown in terms of its value for its products, and the cash drain of the hard currency that's leaving Europe as we kind of pull ourselves out of the dark ages and we're beginning to progress, right? The tried and true method is overland. There's an expense to traveling overland. For example, every time you go into somebody else's little kingdom or fiefdom, you got to pay, a toll. We'll call it a toll, but it's really it's more like you're paying. You're being, you're just being taken advantage of to the degree, exploited to the degree that if you want to go through my territory to get to these products, to get to the market, to get to the back home, you've got to pay the toll, right? If you don't pay the toll, then we're not going to let you through. So you can see there's an added cost to that, right? On top of that, you have these fairly well-known silk, spice, these roads where if individuals are looking for money's coming in or product going out, if I'm going to steal it, that's exactly where I'm going to set up shop, right? So you've got these land pirates along the way that also add cost to this process of bringing product to market. And so Columbus and others, and we know now historically that even before 1492, there were individuals from Europe who had come to what is North America and what is present-day United States. I mean, we know that factually. But as far as the wide world knowing it and kind of establishing it as a new fact, if you will, it really comes with Columbus's discovery. And so Columbus, to your point, says, hey, if the world's not flat, but around, right? The world, she's around, because he was Italian, and that's, obviously Italian. But if the world's around, and I sail off of this away, I'm going to come up over here, right? And that's his pitch. And nobody's buying it. But he takes it to Spain, and right, Queen Isabella and the king and the queen, they're like, yeah, you know what? We'll fund this. We'll let you do this. And so he sails out with the 3 ships, right? We know the story. And his trajectory and his estimation of the circumference of the world, they're way off. I mean, they're way, way off. And so as he's sailing on what he believes to be the right trajectory to end up over here in the Indies, he gets out a bit. And if you actually take a look at his navigation, his charts, he gets out about as far as he thought it would take him to get. And then there looks like these wild searches going on. And, he's got the problem with his crew. Supposedly it's mutinying or planning on doing the mutiny, the whole 9 yards. He's got kind of at the last day, his wit's end, and boom, somebody sees land. Land ho, right? And as we know from history, we know that it's not the East Indies. It is the West Indies. Of course, they don't call it the West Indies. Well, they call it the West Indies back then. It wasn't called the West Indies back then, but they name it because he assumes he's gotten to the Indies. He's done it, right? He's out there in the Caribbean islands, and he's out there looking for the spices, looking for the gold, looking for the silk, looking for all these hard currencies and riches that have been pushed down from the Europe into parts in between. And it's really not there. Now, eventually he comes sailing back and explains that he believes he's found the route, but he's confused as to why the items that they're looking for are not there. Again, the advantage to doing this sailing one way, picking up the goods and then sailing back, is that you would cut out all of this stuff in the middle. You cut out the tolls, you cut out the pirates, you cut out, all this in the middle, the middleman, so to speak. You'd even cut the market out, right? Which is kind of in between the two, is where the market is, right? And so Columbus is, he's expecting to get paid from this. That's the incentive. That's the motive. He's also an adventurer, right? But at the same time, this is his gig, and he's got an agreement with Spain that that he will not only be compensated, but he'll also be in charge of lands found and things to that nature. And we know that Columbus ultimately settles on the Isle of Hispaniola, which is modern day Dominican Republic and Haiti. And we also know that the Spanish sailing in with their ships with the big red crosses and their silver-clad armor get off the boats, and the natives, who had seen nothing like that, that we know of anyway, they falsely believe these individuals are some supernatural gods or entities, and they basically, for fear, bend over to worship these individuals. And we also know that Columbus, and within this discovery, enslaves these individuals, right? With the slave trade, enslaves these individuals, or at least attempts to, and makes them terrible slaves. Regardless, this is all going on, right? Confusion as to whether or not we've made this route proper or not. At the same time, actually just shortly thereafter, I believe it's 1490, I'm going to say 97. Again, this is why I don't tell you guys that I'm going to ask you about any dates, because I'm not always sure about them myself. But I know that it's 1492 because of the rhyme, and I'm sure it's shortly thereafter because, well, I just know it as history. John Cabot, he sails out from Europe as well. Now, he sails out not under a Spanish flag, but under an English flag. And instead of sailing in the general direction of trying to pop up over here, he just sails due west. And in sailing due west, he hits Newfoundland. And they actually still call it Newfoundland. All right, it's Newfoundland or Newfoundland, Canada. But he hits that, comes back, tells the king, hey, sure as crap, Columbus isn't crazy. There's Newfoundland over there. And that sort of discovery becomes the basis of England laying claim to this kind of eastern seaboard as the land grab begins to commence shortly thereafter. Of course, we have Amerigo Vespucci, right, who also comes in, and he sails up and down the coasts, I believe, of North America and South America, but certainly North America, and that's where you guys know the history, right? America comes from, that they actually don't call it Columbica, but America, even though they recognize that Columbus is the first to quote unquote discover the New World. Even though, again, we know historically, factually, there were Europeans who came to the quote unquote New World even before the late 1400s, right? So regardless, history is story, right? History is a weird thing, right? You get what you get. So this, as I said, really Cabot's discovery eventually allows England to at least make the claim to the eastern seaboard. And you can make the claim all day long. The ability to hold it, to keep it, right, that then becomes the issue. And England's strong enough to keep the eastern seaboard, and as other countries are trying to also get their foot into the New World. Any questions about this so far? Questions? Questions? So Columbus starts it. We know why. It's a self-interest. It's a material benefit. He's doing it. He's challenging the current science, believing, again, that there's a better way to build this mousetrap, or a better path, right, that's going to reap riches for those who will invest. He doesn't have the dollars himself, so he has to go out and find financiers. The financiers is the country, the state of, right? Spain backs him in this, but he's the individual who ultimately sails off the edge of the world, right? And that's no easy feat, okay? So the lay, the claim, and the fame that comes along with what Columbus did, I think, is warranted to that degree. But obviously, we can look back and, based upon our 2020 interpretations of right and wrong, can look back and say, hey, this guy may not have been that great with these, at least the treatment of the natives as he made his way to the New World. But short of that, we know that history then favors that this opens up the kind of the land grab, if you will, where other countries, the Dutch, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, certainly, the English, are all looking to get a foothold in the New World. Why? Well, government decides who gets what. The other way to say that is government allocates the scarce what? Resources. Well, if you think about it, what was, right, kind of England, see, Spain, right? So this is obviously Europe. And what was in England at the time, or in anywhere in Europe, is the world was already, the known world was already divided up, right, among those individuals who controlled it and had it. I mean, enough people have been around long enough to create kingdoms and secure those kingdoms. It didn't mean that they didn't change hands and that the boundaries didn't change. But for the most part, the resources were accounted for, and the resources were, dibs were placed on them. What this new world represented, sans the Native Americans, was free resources. Resources for the taking. It's like hitting a gold mine in your backyard, or an oil mine or an oil well in your backyard. It's there, and it's available if you could get over and establish and take it. That's the incentive, right? The new world, the incentive of the new world is that all of these resources. Resources equal quality of life. Resources equal wealth. So if we can control these new resources, that gives us better quality of life. It gives us more power. Controlling resources gives power. And so the land grab, the push is on. Right? Remember, we had this relationship where there was a drain of hard currency, cash on its way out. We had this already going on, and for basically goods that would diminish over time. They weren't they had a lifespan on them, and so this represented extra resources and ultimately maybe even competition, right? So the land grab is on. Cabot's discovery, right, gives England at least a foothold in an argument that this area up here, the eastern seaboard, is by right theirs. Now, there are other countries who are already, we know about New York and the Dutch and New Amsterdam originally and changing hands. So we know that there are other countries, the Finns, the Scandinavians also are in this area. But, we're going to start really with the English. Does anybody know the first permanent settlement that's still a settlement today, right? It's kind of been there the whole time. It's never not been a part of that's St. Augustine. So St. Augustine, Florida, Spanish settlement, the first of all, it's been there. There's still a St. Augustine. But for the English, does anybody know the first? Yeah, go ahead.
Jamestown?
Yeah, Jamestown. That's the first permanent. There's one prior, an attempt prior. Anybody know that one?
Roanoke?
Yeah, Roanoke. Yeah, good job. Yeah, so Roanoke's that first attempt, and that's in 1585-ish, right? The later part of the 1500s. And so look, 1492, and we're 100 years later before we're actually establishing an English colony, right? So again, just to give you some concept, this is not big bang boom. This isn't, hey, we discover America, ooh, boom, America's good, and then let's revolt. It doesn't happen like that, right? There's some steps in between, a few hundred years, right? I mean, if we start with 1776 as our Declaration of Independence, right? 240 years, 240 years, right? That we've been a country, our own independent country. Yeah,
what incentive did the citizens have to move over to the New World?
Well, that's a great question. And if you didn't hear, the question was, what incentive do the citizens have to ultimately come and populate this new world? And so again, back to that self-interest. Quality of life, I think, is the strongest motivating factor. Yeah, go ahead.
What's that colonization?
Let's say a colonization. Yep, yeah, exactly. So, but it's not forced colonization, right? In terms of, for Australia, for example, there are a lot of individuals that were pushed to Australia because they were ne'er-do-wells, right? They were convicts, and I'm sure some of that also took place in the United States to be banished to the New World, not United States yet, right? Just North America, Eastern Seaboard, New England, but there is also the incentive of individuals wanting to have a better quality of life. Religious freedom would also be one night you were going to hit on, right? So religious freedom. So we get into like the quote unquote pilgrims in Plymouth, right? Individuals looking for, they're not breaking away from England, but they're exercising the distance for autonomy, right? It's hard to be under the king's thumb so far away, and so it provides for individuals more freedom, more autonomy to live a quality of life that they perceive to be correct. So I mean, we get to England comes pretty, or Plymouth comes pretty quickly after Jamestown. So Jamestown's like 1607-ish. Jamestown's like Plymouth is like 1609, right in there. Okay, so it's real close to that. So, but Roanoke, the first attempt, and I say attempt because Roanoke came, Roanoke went, Roanoke's back again, but that colony didn't last for whatever reason. We're not exactly 100% sure. There's probably some more studies since I took a look at it last, but for the most part, we don't exactly know what happened to the lost colony. They either simply were swept away or migrated in. Hang on one second. Okay, sorry about that. My wife's texting me, and usually she knows I'm teaching. She will text me, but that was just a little "I love you," which is very nice, but at the same time. Anyway, so Roanoke Island comes and goes. The next one is Jamestown, and Jamestown doesn't look like it's going to survive either, right? So if you know your history, it's not exactly the greatest place to establish a colony. I mean, we have all these kind of. I mean, we think about the disease we bring to the New World. The New World also had some diseases here that we weren't ready for either. And so the mosquitoes, the infestation, it's not a very good place to establish a colony. Yet we established Jamestown as a colony, and we don't have the relationship with the Native Americans the Pilgrims do. There's some bloody fights there as well. And it looks like, due to the death rate, due to the inhospitable conditions, Jamestown's not going to last. But there's a cash crop, something that grows extremely well, that has a lot of support and a lot of interest by the investors from back home. Anybody know what that cash crop is? Anybody? Go ahead.
Corn.
Corn's a good one, but that's not the one.
Tobacco.
It is tobacco. Yeah, tobacco's the big one, right? Tobacco saves America. Right? Put that on your side of your cigarette, right? There's truth to that. Without the tobacco, there's a very good chance that Jamestown would have been kind of the second failure in a row. And then good luck getting individuals to brave the seas, to set up in a hostile environment without the pretense of having a better quality of life by becoming a planter, or at least the freedom of the individual from being out from anybody's thumb, or having religious freedom. Right, as some individuals, not all, some individuals came here to find as well. So those are the things that are really pushing individuals over here. The better quality of life, a purposeful life, a religious life, just the freedom and autonomy that comes, maybe even the adventure of being from outside of what is already the known and controlled world. Those are the things I think that would drive an individual, and did drive the individuals over here. So we established Jamestown. The second, as we know, is Plymouth. Interesting thing about Plymouth, we don't tend to think about seconds, right? People who came in second. Who was the second person to land on the moon? Who was the second to win the Kentucky Derby? We don't tend to think about seconds when it comes to memories of history. But we do spend a lot of time thinking about, talking about Plymouth, not only for the religious pilgrimage or separatists that came with that. About half of the Mayflower was actual religious pilgrims. The other half were individuals who were just looking for that better quality of life. We're talking about adventurers or whatever the case may be. But as we remember, I mean, we know we have Thanksgiving, so that kind of forces us to remember. But for political scientists, Plymouth is a pretty big deal because it's a pretty big deal because it's one of those opportunities in history where individuals are given, right, a group of people are given a blank slate with the potential of having no government over their shoulders or on their back, no preordained government and structure, and they're given a clean slate, and they're allowed to kind of choose and pick and form their government as they think is in their best interest, right? It doesn't happen very often. You were born into this system of government. I was born in a system of government. The nice thing is we get a hand in changing it, right? Through elections and choosing different leaders and amending the Constitution as we choose to, or if we choose to. But these guys, these pilgrims, there's an argument made that they're really the first true Americans in the context that they established the first Constitution, if you will. So a Constitution, I'm going to just give you kind of an easy definition, but a Constitution, it's a rule book. It's a rule book on how to govern, right? It kind of defines, it's an agreement, it's a contract on how to govern, right? So if we think about the United States Constitution or the state constitutions that predated it, those constitutions were contracts in terms of the structure of government, how the government would operate, what the individual's responsibilities were, and what the government's responsibilities were to the individuals. That's a constitution. And England really doesn't have a constitution. It has this kind of big book of laws that have been put in place over time. And there were, because of course we had the Magna Carta that took place prior to this, and there was some representative government going on in England, but certainly nothing like today, where the individuals truly are in charge in the United States and back in England as well. But again, even though England has a king and a queen or a monarch system, it's still a system, a parliamentary system of representative democracy, representative government. So our structure, we don't have a constitution yet, but as the Mayflower comes in, as it comes in and it lands at Plymouth Rock, right? Before it gets there, as they sailed out, they were given license to be basically on the bank of the Hudson River, not too far away from Jamestown. Well, they missed that. And they were actually north of that, north of the hook, right? That is the Cape, right? You see it on the map, right? Kind of like Italy. We know where Massachusetts is because of the shoals, the hook, the Cape. Well, they're north of that. And then, so they come in and it takes a couple of months to get across the ocean, right? It takes a long time to get across the ocean, at least a month to get across the ocean. And I think they left in September, and it's getting into, I think, November. I'm trying to, again, get my bearing straight on the time frame. But let's just say it takes quite some time. And this isn't, the Titanic. Well, maybe a bad example. This isn't, the Queen Mary or some other, luxury cruise line, right? This is a ship made for utility to just get passengers across with their stuff. And the longer that takes, you can imagine how uncomfortable that becomes. And so once they do spot land, the question is, do we get off here or do we stay on the boat and travel to our intended destination, which is further south? This is pretty hazardous to try to get around this, so I guess, I'm told. And so that was part of the question. And so the question from the captain went to the individuals, to the passengers. And the passengers then were given the choice. Do we want to get off here? Or do we want to go further south? Well, they decide that they're going to get off here. Well, this creates a question, right? If we get off here, outside of the charter, the Virginia charter, And don't think of the Virginia Charter as just the size of Virginia or even Virginia and West Virginia, but the Virginia Charter being really much of the eastern seaboard, which was kind of open end. This was the claim of England. Well, they're outside of that. They're north of that. And the question then arises, you know, if we get off the ship here, we get off the Mayflower here, whose laws govern us? Are we still the subjects of the king and queen? Because if you think about it, laws are really attached to territory. They're attached to land, right? Anybody 19? Anybody 19, older than 19? Older than 19? Anybody older than 19 and younger than 21? And older than 19, younger than 21? Okay, right in there, right? So you older than 19, younger than 21-year-old, let's after this go get a beer. That sounds like a good idea, right? Probably inappropriate, but let's go get a beer. You say, oh, I can't get a beer. You can't get a beer. Let's go to Canada. Probably wildly inappropriate, but I'm going to take you to Canada and we'll go get a beer. Totally legal. I don't know about the transporting across state lines and all that stuff. That's different. But just going and getting a beer, how old do you have to be to get a beer in Canada?
18?
I know it's 19, but maybe it's 18. Don't tell my son.
19.
Is it 19? Somebody back there with authority. It's 19. Yeah, so.
No idea, I've never been.
Yeah, well, you know, and I don't have to worry about it anymore. Those days I ain't worried about being old enough to drink early. Long gone. But the point being, we go to Canada, we're good. We stay in the United States or in Michigan, well, the United States really, we're not so good, right? Laws are attached to land. And so, and I can see we're running out of time here, but that's true here as well. That's the question. And so the individuals who ultimately they decide we're going to get off the ship here, they have to come to some agreement before they get off the boat as to how are they going to, you know, what laws are they going to live by, how are the laws going to affect them, how do they approach or address issues that may not be within the English law. And that's where we get what's called the Mayflower Compact. And the Mayflower Compact is this written agreement of the individuals getting off the ship, basically about how to govern. So a first constitution, maybe. I guess the argument's there. At any rate, we know the history. We know they get off. We know they're not going to be able to make it the first winter. We know they get the support from the Native Americans, and we get Turkey now on that fourth Thursday in November. Woo! So, all right. So just as we're rolling out of this, again, make sure you're reading up on the lecture notes that are online. They kind of go over the things that we're going over, and I think take out the major concepts and really focus on those major concepts. Very good supplement to use as a study guide. And to do that, at least by next week, Monday, have it done before Monday, that posting, okay, on the originalism question. Question to the question? Boom, have a great weekend, you guys. We'll pick up right there when we come back.